The Tiny Homes on Wheels ordinance was a big step by county supervisors at their January 14th meeting as one of the many ways we're working to address the housing crisis. The ordinance will go into effect on February 13th. Tyler Barrington is our subject matter expert on this if you're interested. And Tyler, let me know if you have any questions that you want to throw out there. But it's nice to have you here. We're glad you're here. And I guess, first of all, how about can you give us just an overview of what the Tiny Wheels Ordinance is?
Sure. Thank you, Keith. So the Tiny Homes on Wheels Ordinance is essentially allowing for tiny homes on wheels that meet certain design criteria to be permitted as single-family dwellings in all areas in the county that allow for a permanent single-family home. We'd also allow them to be a accessory dwelling unit or both. And then there's a few other caveats in terms of other ways that you could get more than one tiny home on your property.
Okay. You said tiny homes, there's certain specifications. Does they got to be so big?
Correct.
Not too big?
Yeah, so the county used essentially the state's definition of a park model RV to start with. And essentially it allows up to 400 square feet. It has to have a DMV registration, and so it has to meet the criteria so it can be pulled down the highway.
Okay. Okay, let me ask you this. How do people apply for this if they're in need of shelter, need of a home? Yep. Do they apply through the county for this, or how does that work?
Yeah, so essentially someone would be required to obtain a building permit to not so much for the home itself, that'd be inspected off-site, but you need a building permit for your connection to water, to sewer, or septic. You need a building permit for connection to electricity. You would need a fire-safe driveway, and then the building department would also inspect the tie-downs to make sure that the unit was properly connected to the ground.
Wasn't going to blow away or
Correct.
Something. Not a tent trailer or something.
Not a tent trailer.
It's got to be more than that.
It does.
Are these usually like RVs?
They're not so much RVs. I mean, they meet a state definition of a park model trailer. They're RVs. They do require that they're built with 2x4 construction. They are required to be insulated. And so there's kind of two different things that were discussed during the ordinance process, and one of which was the tiny homes on wheels. Okay. And then there was some desire and discussion from the community about allowing for other recreational vehicles like motor coaches, cab over campers, fifth wheels. And that's something that the board has directed the county to look at over the next year and determine whether or not that those regulations can be put in place.
Okay. Now, tiny homes on wheels and ADUs, which are additional dwelling units, I think is the acronym, right?
It's accessory dwelling units.
Accessory dwelling
Correct.
units, okay. What's the difference between the two of those?
So there really is. I mean, accessory dwelling unit is a secondary home. And currently the county's codes allow for a secondary home not to exceed 1,200 square feet as a detached unit. A tiny homes on wheels could suffice as that accessory dwelling unit. So instead of building a traditional stick-built house for your accessory dwelling unit, you'd be allowed to go through the permit process and use a tiny home on wheels for that purpose.
Okay. I know my parents were snowbirds when they first retired, went to Arizona, and there was a lot of, they called them park models at that time, smaller mobile homes, I thought they were, but apparently that would be considered a tiny home on wheels. Now,
it would. I think what differentiates a tiny home on wheels from like a recreational vehicle or a standard park model is the construction type. But there's also design criteria that requires siding, requires dual pane windows with trim, and other things to kind of make the tiny home kind of fit more of a residential character.
Okay. Now, you're talking about if somebody puts one somewhere in the county. What about in the cities of Nevada City or Grass Valley? Do you have to go? Do the cities have processes in place to do this?
So it's my understanding that the cities don't currently allow for tiny homes on wheels. So this applies in the unincorporated area of Nevada County.
Okay. Now I also have seen on social media there's a fellow named and excuse me if I don't get his name right. He's Brad Pessimer or I don't know if I said that right or not.
Close enough.
But you obviously know who I'm talking about.
I do.
And I know he always says, hey, I got this RV donated. I need somebody to help me haul it to Nevada County. I mean, most of them look pretty decent. Like I'd keep it for an RV and use it, but somebody donates it to him. Do you work with him at all, or how does that work?
So I don't know the specifically.
I don't know what his organization is,
Right.
or if it's just him.
I do know that Brad spoke at the public hearings, and so I kind of heard some of the stuff that he does. If he were to use a vehicle or a tiny home on wheels that met all the design criteria and was permitted, then we would work with him on that.
Okay.
But I don't know that these structures or these recreational vehicles he's using, whether or not those do meet the tiny homes on wheels definition.
Is for somebody to want to have one of these at their home, an additional dwelling or a tiny homes on wheels, is there a lot size minimum or something like that? Do you have to be on a half acre or just on a city lot sized, or what?
So essentially you'd have to have zoning that would allow for a residential unit.
Okay.
And in Nevada County, virtually all of our zoning districts allow for you to have a single family home or an accessory dwelling unit. So technically your tiny home could be one of the two or both.
And how do people how do you find people that need to live in these? How do they come to you? Do you go to them? Is it part of through public health and their homeless outreach through Hospitality House or whatever? Is that?
So I think there's a misnomer that the intention of tiny homes on wheels was to solve the homeless crisis.
Okay.
Typically these units, there is a cost involved in terms of providing septic and water and electrical connections in the unit itself. So the assumption is it'll be a private property owner that might come in, and maybe they have a house already and they're looking for somewhere to put up maybe their college age kids or maybe their parents, in a way to get them placed into a structure that could be permanent housing kind of right away, instead of going through the process of finding contractors and building and all that stuff.
Or maybe an in-law or something.
Correct.
Something like that, a grandparent. Oh, so this is more, tiny homes on wheels is more for family type situations than housing the homeless.
Correct. Yeah, I would think it would be more suitable for like workforce housing. Type of thing. And then, there are specific things that you need to do. For example, the way the ordinance is currently written, it doesn't allow for short-term rentals.
Okay.
And the idea behind that was, the intention was, we're trying to find housing solutions for locals that need long-term housing.
Okay.
And so that's one of the restrictions that was placed on it. It's very similar to what the Board of Supervisors in 2019, when we adopted a new accessory dwelling unit ordinance, they restricted short-term rentals of those units.
So now somebody that places one of these units on their property, they can charge rent?
Correct.
Okay, so I could put out a flyer and say, I have this park model, 1-bedroom, mobile home. Anybody's interested, I'll rent it for X amount of dollars, and they can do that.
Correct. I mean, I'd probably call it a tiny home on wheels.
Tiny home on wheels.
Because there is a difference between a mobile home and a tiny home.
Right.
But yes, and the county wouldn't be involved in that relationship between the property owner and who they desire to rent to.
Okay. And this is strictly, they got to be on wheels.
Correct. Yeah, it does require that the wheels remain. It does require some skirting around the wheels itself. And the county looked at about 5 or 6 different counties and jurisdictions that have already adopted ordinances in developing the one that we came up with.
Now, I know that I've seen on local news reports coming out of Sacramento, news stories about tiny homes, and they're actually like on a foundation. They're on a slab or something. They look like little cabins or something, but that's something totally different.
That would be something totally different. That would be subject to the California Building Code.
Okay. All right. Good enough. Anything else you want to add about this?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head. I just think that, the intention here is to take one step towards addressing the housing crisis. It's not meant to be the end-all be-all. It's not a one-shot solution, if you will. And it's a multi-pronged effort to deal with the housing crisis that we're seeing in Nevada County and California alike.
Well, yeah, the cost of housing is getting incredible.
It's amazing.
And not just the price, but when you throw in insurance and things like that, it's even more challenging.
Absolutely.
So, all right. Well,
Great.
thank you very much.
Thank you, Keith.
Appreciate your time.
You bet.